Hello, everybody. So let's get this lecture started. So the plan for today is to tell you about quiz 1. And then it's to walk through writing two scripts where you have to do something non-trivial in both scripts. Okay? So quiz 1. The format is question 1. You get 12 short answer questions. By short answer, I mean short answer. I don't mean write a paragraph that does blah. Right? Please don't write a paragraph that explains blah. Right? Everything can be answered in one sentence, or one number, or one line of code. In one case, there's a few lines of code. You have to write some kind of compound statement. That's all I'm going to say about that. Right? They're all very basic knowledge. Okay? So you should be able. There's no obscure. Look, you've all seen Bash, right? You know that I could give you a very, very hard quiz. Right? They ask you very obscure stuff. There's no obscure stuff on the quiz, right? There's no what is the error in this script, what is this line of code print or stuff like that, right? It's all very straightforward, right? You should know the answer to these questions. Yeah.
On the exams, you're supposed to do the last few pages to be like, I don't know, just like you give a list of what all the dash F, dash E, all.
Yeah. You don't have that on this. No. So you don't have the big reference sheet on this quiz. But again, you don't actually need to know 90% or 95% of what's on that reference sheet, right? So when I get to the next part, I'll tell you exactly what it is you need to know. All right. So the next one is two short coding questions. By short coding questions, I mean one line of code, right? So I don't mean like write a big script that does blah. It's like literally what is the one line of code that does blah. Okay? The next one is a short script. By short script, I mean fewer than 5 lines of code. Right? And then finally, there is a medium-sized script where you have to put together many of the constructs that you've learned or you should have learned up to this point in the course. Okay, now, what are the topics that are covered? So these are the notebooks that are covered. Right, so introduction to the command line, I mean, that's not really worth reading. Well, maybe it's worth reading to review some of the commands that are used there. Right? You do need to understand the Linux file system. Right? So you need to understand how the Linux file system is organized, how the information is stored for files, and things like that. Right? Of course, this is a bash. Right? This is a bash quiz, so you have to understand commands. Right? You have to understand some file name expansions. You have to understand what star question mark do, right? You have to understand the significance of quoting, when it has to be done, when you don't have, well, when it has to be done. Right? How do you move, remove, rename files and things like that, copy files, right? You have to understand how to change permissions on a file and what it means for a file to have certain permissions. Streams, redirections, pipelines, and Ts, right? So you need to understand what's the difference between standard in, standard out, standard error, right? How to redirect stuff to a file, how to redirect stuff to standard error, things like that. Now the expansions, right? So I don't care if you know what the brace expansions are for this quiz, and there are no command substitutions either, right? So there's no point where you have to run a command, store the result in a variable. Okay. Obviously, you have to know how to write a bash script, right? You have to know how to use variables. Now, you have to know how to use strings, but I don't ask you all of that obscure stuff about how do I obtain or how do I replace this part of a string, right? Or this substring in a string, or how do you remove this part of a string, or stuff like that, right? All that stuff, you don't have to memorize the syntax for that, right? And no real programmer would memorize it either unless they've been programming in Bash for years and years and years, right? You would just look it up. Anything that you would look up, I'm not asking you on this quiz. Of course, you do need to know how the basics of using a string, right? It's like, how do I get the length of a string? How do I obtain a substring from a string, right? But all that string replacement stuff, don't worry about it, right? It's not relevant for this quiz. You have to know how to do an arithmetic substitution, right? So how do I compute, I don't know, x plus y or something like that, right? And finally, you need to know how to write an if statement. Now, for the if statement, you do need to know, you need to remember how to do things like, how do I test if a file exists? How do I test if it's readable? How do I test if it's writable? Right? You have to know how to compare two strings for equality. You don't have to know any regular expressions, right? So there's no regular expressions on this quiz. What else? There's no arrays, there's no loops, right? None of that stuff's on the quiz, right? So it's basically the stuff from the first 4 weeks-ish of the course, okay? Any other questions about the quiz? Right, so it is in class, right? So it's going to be on Wednesday in here. If you have academic accommodations, everything is being done through Ventus, right? So you should have already, as far as I can tell, you've already, if you have an academic accommodation, you've already said that you know about your accommodation and that you're going to write the test with them. Right? They have the test and everything. All right? So if you have an academic accommodation, you're not supposed to write it here, right? You're supposed to write it with the exams office. You can write it here if you want to. It's just you're not going to get the, your accommodation met here. All right. Any other questions? Any questions at all about the quiz? Yes? Is it going to be pen and paper? Yeah, it's pen and paper, unfortunately. The one nice thing about having, the one nice thing about the pandemic where you wrote things on OnCue was that I didn't have to read your handwriting. The bad thing is it takes way longer to mark an OnCue test than it takes me to write a paper test. So I can mark a paper test in about 2 or 3 minutes. To mark the same test on OnCue would take me like 10 or 15. It takes forever to type stuff in and to give you feedback and stuff. Right. So when you're writing, please try to make sure that your handwriting is approximately legible. I need to be able to read it in order to give you marks. Yes? Yeah, it was always pen and paper. So before the pandemic, yeah. I've actually, so I didn't, I mean, I've only been here 3 years. So I never taught this course before the pandemic. This is the first time it's been, where it's been in person. All those exams that you saw, none of those are my exams. Those are all exams written by previous instructors. Okay, on to the lecture. Let's see. This is 124, so we don't want that. This is also 124, so I don't want that. Okay, so I want the following. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some old some old assignment questions, and I'm going to show you how to answer these assignment questions. This will also be useful for assignment 3, which will come out later today or tomorrow, probably tomorrow. Also will be useful for the quiz because obviously I'm going to review a bunch of quiz stuff in this in today's lecture. All right, so I want to write this script called check files. Now, what's check files supposed to do? So when I get your assignments, basically I download them from OnCue. OnCue gives me this giant zip file with all your assignment files in it. A lot of the time when I go to mark your assignments or when I have the TAs mark your assignments, I give them a bunch of unit tests, right? So the unit tests, they have to compile against your code, right? And what that means is your code, the code that the students submit, it has to have the right names, it has to have the right methods, et cetera, right? Or otherwise it's not going to compile. So one of the really infuriating things is that students often don't submit the right files, right? So it's useful for me to have a little script that goes through all of these OnCue files and tells me, did they actually name the name of their file correctly, or did they give me something else, right? One of the most common things in 124 is that people submit the compiled class file instead of submitting the Java file, right? And that's really annoying. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to write this script called check files. Check files is going to read a file, right? So that file is going to be is going to contain all of the files that are expected for this assignment, right? So for example, right, one of your 120 or 220 quizzes assignments, sorry, right? I might expect you to submit a file called q1.sh, q2.sh, and q4.sh. Right? So there's going to be a file that this script is going to read in order to determine which file should it look for. Right? In this file, there can be comments. Right? So there I've commented out q3.sh. Right? So a comment starts with a hashtag. Right? Similarly, this file might have blank lines. Right? So I need to ignore whatever blank lines are in this file. Right? So that's step one. I got to read this file somehow and parse this file, right, to determine which files am I actually looking for. Okay, so that's what's called the spec file, right? So that's going to be the command line argument to my script, right? Now, you don't actually know how to read a file in bash, so that's how you read a file in bash line by line, right? So there's a command called read that can read the contents of a file line by line, right? So while read line, do, right? Line is just the name of a variable, right? So this is the string that it stores the current line in, right? So inside your while loop, you can access that string and process that string, right? The way that you send a file to the read command is with this funny syntax here, right? So you redirect the file into the read command with that syntax there, right? So that little loop will read a file line by line in bash, so that's handy to know. Right? Okay, so if the script file is missing, right, then the script should output an error message, right? Say, hey, I need this spec file in order to determine which files I should be looking for. If that file does not exist or can't be read, then that's an error too, right? So in other words, the script has to be able to read this spec file. Now, for every file listed in the spec file, the script is going to do nothing if the listed file is a regular file in the current working directory, right? So the way the script is going to work is I'm going to switch to a student's directory. I'm going to run this script in that directory, and the script is going to check, are all of the files that are in the spec file also in this directory, right? So if the files are in the directory, the script does nothing, right? It doesn't print anything, it just exits, right? Whenever it finds a file that's missing, so whenever it finds a file that's not in the, whenever it finds a file that's in the spec file that's not in the current directory, it says that file is missing, right? And then but it doesn't stop, right? So it looks at all of the files that are in the current directory and it tries to match them to the files in the spec file, right? If it finds one that's not in the spec file, if it finds a file, if there's a file in the spec file that's not in the current directory, it prints an error message, but it keeps on going. So it processes all of the files in the spec file. And then finally, if one or more of the files are missing, the script exits with a status of 3. Right? So here are some example outputs. Right? So I'm going to run my script with no input arguments. Right? No input arguments, it outputs an error message and then stops. Right? So you're supposed to specify a spec file. Right? This is what happens when the spec file is missing. Right? So if the file my spec file is not there, right? The script tells you that the file is missing or can't be read, and then stops. Right? Here's spec file number 1. So if all of the files in spec file 1 are in the current directory, nothing happens. Right? Everything's good. That means the student submitted the right files. Right? Now here's what happens when someone has not submitted all of the files that are required. Right? So in this case, the student has forgotten to submit q1.py, and they've forgotten to submit q3.py. Right? And so your task here, or our task here, is to write this script. Right? Okay, so I'm just going to pull up the answer here because I'm not actually going to be able to memorize exactly how this works. And so let's take a look at how this works. Okay, so here's our. I'm not doing this in the virtual machine. I'm just doing this in the Windows for Linux for Windows. Okay, so this is what check files is going to look like, right? So step 1, I'm going to check, right, if there are no command line arguments, right? So remember how many command line arguments are there? Well, there are a number of command line arguments, right? Because this is an arithmetic condition, I can use the double round brackets in this case, right? So whenever I'm checking an arithmetic condition, I prefer double round over double square, right? If you want to use double square, you have to use dollar number space hyphen NE, not equal, or sorry, equal, EQ 0, right? Which is a lot harder for me to read than it is for me for this, compared to this, right? So if the spec file is missing, I'm going to echo or print an error message to standard. I want to print it to standard error because that's what the question says to do. Right? Now remember, echo prints to standard output, so I have to redirect standard output to standard error. That's what that does. Right? So the greater than and 2 copies standard output to standard error. So whatever gets written to standard output now goes to standard error instead. Right? Exit 1 causes the script to stop and set the exit status to 1. Right? Okay, if I get past this if statement, then I know that there is in fact, the user has in fact specified a file that I can try to read. Right? So now the question says, right? So if the spec file does not exist or cannot be read, then the script outputs an error message to standard error and exits with a status of 2. So now I have to check, does the file exist? Right, so that's easy. That's just if, right, minus E, $1, right, and not, right? So remember, minus E is does the file, minus E $1. Sorry, not $1. What am I doing? Well, you could write $1, but I already created a variable here, so that's that. All right, so minus E $spec file tests, is this file, right? Does this file exist in the current working directory, right? The exclamation mark negates it. So this is if the spec file does not exist in the current working directory, right? Semicolon, then, right? I need an error message. I'm just going to copy this one, right? So this is spec file does not exist, right? Does not exist, or whatever the assignment says. I don't know what the assignment says to do, right? It's not important. You need to print out an error message, right? And then it's supposed to exit with a status of 2, I think. So that's easy. Exit with 2, right? So that's if it doesn't exist. Now, what if it's not readable? Well, that's just an else, right? So, well, I guess we can do it. And another. Oh, sorry. I don't love code. All right. So there you go. So does the okay? Does the file is the file not readable? So exclamation mark minus R, right? $spec file. Right. Again, I need an error message, so I'm just going to copy that. Spec file is not readable. And I think it's still supposed to exit with exit status 2, so I can leave that. Okay, so if I get to this point now, I know that the spec file exists, it's readable, it's a regular file, right? Actually, I should check if it's a regular file. Anyway, it's fine. In this case, you really should check if it's a regular file, because it could be a directory too, but whatever. The assignment doesn't say that, so I'm not going to check for it. I'm not going to test for it. If you want to test, is it a regular file, you would use minus F, right? So minus F tests if it's a regular file. Oh, actually, I guess I can do this. Minus F tests if it's a regular file and is readable. So is that true? Exists and is readable. So I should change this one and leave that one as that. Okay. So spec file does not exist or is not a regular file. Or is not. So that's better, not a regular. All right. So once we get to this point, the spec file is readable. So now I just read the spec file. How do I read the spec file? Well, I just copy that loop from the assignment, right? So while read line, do, do, done. Okay. And I need to, what do I need to do? I need to do something like this. Right? Yeah, something like that. Okay. All right. Okay, now, when you write that, right there is where you need to remember what happens if you use an unquoted variable, right? So that's an unquoted variable, and that means word splitting is going to happen on it, right? Word splitting and file name expansion will happen on it, right? So if the spec file happens to have a space in its name, that's going to cause an error, right? This needs to be quoted, right? In order to make sure that that's treated as a single string rather than as a sequence of words, right? So that's, in this particular case, that's important. Okay, let's see. So let's go back and quickly look at the spec file again. Okay, so we got some file examples up here, right? So we see that there are some blank lines, right? So we're supposed to ignore any blank lines, right? Similarly, we're supposed to ignore anything that starts with a hashtag symbol, right? So how do I test if the line is blank? So remember line, that's the name of that's the variable that holds the line. So I want to skip blank lines, right? So if, so here you have to remember how to test for an empty string, right? So if the line is an empty string, that's going to be minus Z line, right? Then phi, okay. So if the line is empty, right? I just want to ignore the line and continue. Right? So in other words, I want the loop to go to its next iteration. Right? So that's continue. Right? I want to skip comments. Right? So to check for this, you have to remember, how do I test if a string starts with a hashtag? Right? In this case, you can test if you want to test how does the string start with a hashtag. Right? So here, you need a regular expression. Right? I want to test, is the line start with a hashtag, right? The only way you can do that, well, not the only way. There's a few ways you could do this. You could extract the first character and test if the first character is a hashtag. You can test if the string starts with a hashtag, which is what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to write a little regular expression, right? So comment regex, oops, no space, equals. So remember how the regexes work, right? I want the regex to match something that starts with. So that's the caret, right, and the hashtag, right? So that's our regular expression to test, does the line start with a hashtag? Right? How do I test if the line matches that regular expression? Well, it's just if line and then equals tilde. Right? Remember, equals tilde is the test of something match a regular expression in Bash. And so I need my comment. Comment reg x. Okay, let me just, so you can read that a little easier. Then, phi. Right? Again, if it starts with a hashtag, it's a comment, so I'm just going to skip the line so I can continue. Right? Cause the loop to go to its next iteration. Okay, now if I reach this point here, there's actually something on the line. So in other words, it is a file name, right? So if I get to this point, then line is a file name, right? I want to test, right? Is there a file in the current directory that matches that file name, right? So that's easy. Actually, what I want to test is I want to test if there is not a file that matches that file name. So if not, I guess F is better in this case. Dollar file name. Okay, right? So if the, oh wait, what am I doing? Why file name? Sorry. Line is a file name, so that's line. There we go. Sorry. Okay. Right? So if that file is not in the current directory, right, then there's a problem. Right? So in other words, that file is missing. Right? And so if the file is missing, I'm supposed to print that the file is missing to standard error. Right? And then I'm supposed to keep on going. Right? So I want to print that is missing. Right? I want to send that to standard error, so greater than and 2. Right? And then I want to keep on going. So that's fine. So keep on going. And otherwise, we do nothing, right? So if the file is there, everything's fine. We just go to the next loop iteration, right? Okay. Now, there's one thing we have to deal with here. Actually, are there any questions so far? Yes?
Could you explain the done less than?
Here?
Yeah.
Okay. That, I need to read in the contents of the spec file, right? Line by line, right? So remember, how do you read in the contents of a file? You use that little loop there, right? So that, all of that is just that right there, except the body of the loop is bigger.
And so why do you, I guess, bring it in at the end of the while loop?
Why is, oh, sorry, why is this here?
Yeah.
Because that's the way it is, right? So if I want to redirect the contents of a file to read, it's redirected at the end. Yeah. So this is actually all one statement in Bash, right? That's all one command. So it's a while loop, so it's a command. I want to redirect the file, right, to the command. Where was I now? Oh, right. Okay. So if there's a missing, so if one or more of the files were missing, right, I have to exit with a status of 3. There's a wrinkle here, though. I have to process all of the files. So normally what you would do, right, so here's where I detect if a file is missing, So if a file that's expected is missing, I'm going to print out that it's missing, right? And this is where I'd like to set the exit status, right? So one of the, you would, if you could stop processing the files, you would just exit with a status of 3, right? I can't though, right? I'm supposed to exit, I'm supposed to process all of the files. So I have to remember that at this point, my status is going to be 3. So I'm going to make a variable called status and set it to 3, right? And then exit down here with that status, right? And I guess up here, just to make everything crystal clear, I'm going to set the status equal to 0 so that if it processes all the files correctly, so if it processes all of the files in the spec file and doesn't find anything missing, it exits with 0, right? Now remember in bash, if a variable doesn't exist and you try to use it, it automatically sets it to 0. So this initialization, I think, is unnecessary. I haven't tested it, but I think it's unnecessary, right? I think it's a little clearer if you set the status here first and then set it here when you have to if it changes, right? And I think that that is it for this file. So save, and let's take it out for a spin and see if it actually works. Where's Ubuntu? Okay. Okay, so check files is here. So I got a spec file, so let's do spec 1. Okay, so there's spec 1, right? So it's got a comment, test1 Java, test2 Java, then a space, test3 Java, then a bunch of spaces, right? You can see that all of those files are here. So if I run this, check files with spec 1, right? It shouldn't print anything because all test1, test2, and test3.java, they all exist, are in the directory. So that's good. What about spec 2? Okay, so spec 2 is just test1, test2, and then a couple of blank lines. So that should also not print anything, which is good. And then spec 3 is, so there's a missing 1 and a missing 2. So the script should print out that missing 1.java is missing 2.java is missing. Oh, spec 3. And it does. And it should also print out that the exit status is 3, right? Well, not print out, the exit status should be set to 3. So the exit status, remember, is stored in the variable question mark. Sorry, it's stored in the variable question mark, right? So if I print that, that should be, why does it keep on doing that? It should be 3, and it is. So that's good. What happens if I run the file with no spec file? Sorry, I think it's scrolling off the bottom. It is, okay. So if I run it with no spec file, I'm supposed to get an error message, and I do, right? If I run it with a spec file that doesn't exist, does not exist, I should get an error message, and it does. So this appears to work. Right? I guess you could, if you really wanted to, you could monkey around with the permissions and make things not readable and things like that, right? But I'm not going to do that right now. All right, any questions for this particular script? Yes?
Oh, can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Every time I do like a big SH file,
Yeah.
whenever I try to run it,
Yeah.
usually the permissions are automatically denied. So
Yeah, so whenever, here, let's, where's my, okay. So I'm going to make a script called temp.sh, okay, using touch. It doesn't matter if you use code or whatever, right? So when I do that, if I look at the permissions of temp.sh, right, you're going to see that I have read and write permission, but I don't have execute permission, right? So you have to set execute permission on that script.
oh, okay.
So change mod u plus x temp. And now I have execute permission. So now I can run it. Yeah. Yeah. So don't forget to set the execute permission on for the user at least on your script files. Otherwise, you won't be able to run them as a command. Okay. Yes.
Just a quick question. Is line a variable that's, I guess, predefined?
No, you can call that whatever you want.
Okay.
You can call that A, you can call that X, you can call that
You're just
whatever you want.
defining it.
Yeah, it's just a variable. Yeah, yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
At the top of the file, you should have the hashtag / exclamation mark / bin / bash.
Yes, this.
Yeah, I noticed I can get the file to run without it.
Yes, you can get the file to run. So if you run a script file that does not have a what the heck is this called? This is an interpreter directive, right? So that thing right there, so hashtag exclamation mark is an interpreter directive. Whatever is after it is the name of the program that will be used to interpret the rest of the file. On Linux, if it's missing, it automatically defaults to bash. On Unix, it'll default to something else probably, depending on how your system is set up, right? So it's always a good idea to put something in to indicate what language the script is actually written in. If you're in Mac, right, you should be doing user bin, and actually you can do this in Linux too. I'm pretty sure this works. So this one uses a program called env to determine, to find the bash program in your particular environment. Right? So in Mac you have to do that because I told you install a newer version of bash. Right? Okay. Any other questions? No? All right. Next problem is uses functions. Okay, so the next question is make this script called scramble. So you basically scramble, you give it a string, and then it randomly scrambles the string to give you a scrambled word. Right? Now, this question asks you to use an array to solve this problem. Right? So number one is, first of all, how do you randomly scramble something? So that you have to figure out how to do that. Right? And then once you figure out how to do that, how do you actually manage to do that using an array? Right? So the question actually breaks this down for you. Right? It says, make sure you use 4 functions. So first create a function called toArray. Right? So toArray takes a string, converts the string into an array by putting each character of the string into the array. Right? So you have the string ABC, you end up with the array. First element is A, second element is B, third element is C. Right? Then it says make a similar function called toString that takes an array and converts the contents of the array to a string. Right? So you have the array ABC, then it takes the individual elements of the array, sticks them all together, and returns a string. Right? Now remember, how do you return something from a bash function? You don't really return something. Right? Instead, this one says print the string to standard output so that whoever calls the function can capture standard output using a command substitution. Right? Now, in order to randomly shuffle a string, right, the letters of a string, you need a function that can return a random number. Right? So it asks you to make this function called rand that generates a random integer between A and B. Right? So it should include A, it should not include B. Right? So 0 and 5 should generate the random numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Right? But it should not produce the 5. Right? Okay, so if you remember, there is a variable called big R random, or all caps random, that stores a random number between 0 and 32,000 something. Right? We need to change that so it returns a random number between A and B. Right? So that's what we have to do there. And finally, there's a function called shuffle that implements that shuffling algorithm right there. So the Fisher-Yates shuffle algorithm is the standard shuffling algorithm used in most random number generators, or most functions or methods that will shuffle a list or an array. So this thing was invented in the 1930s, by a bunch of statisticians. Right? So before they had computers, people were interested in actually generating random sequences of stuff. Right? And this was one of the first algorithms that was devised for it. So the way this works basically is you have numbers 1 through n. Oh. Let's do this over here. Right? So if I have the numbers 1, 2, up to n, oops, and I want to make a random permutation of those numbers, right? So I've got n values. So the way it works is you randomly generate a number between 1 and n, right? So let's say we generate the number 3, right? So you pick the third element in this sequence, so it's the 3, right? So that becomes the first element in your sequence, and then you strike that number from the sequence, right? So in other words, I'm not going to repick this number, right? And now you have n minus 1 remaining numbers. So now I generate a random number between 1 and n minus 1, right? Pick the whatever element I get, right? Strike it from the list and then put it here, and then so on and so on and so on until you get down to 1, right? Where you only have one element left in the list, right? So that's conceptually how it works. The actual algorithm is shown here. So I think, which way am I doing this one? There's 2 versions. I think I'm using the, it doesn't matter which one you use. I'm using the I equals 0 one, this one, n minus 2, length minus 1, 2, yeah, that one. So I'm going to use this version here, right? See, all it is just a little loop, right? You generate a random number j, right, where j is between I, less than n, right? And then you swap elements ai and aj of the array, right? And that's it. So you just repeatedly do this. It runs n minus 1 times, right? So it's an ON algorithm. And that is guaranteed to fairly shuffle any array or list, right? Or any sequence of elements. So we just need to implement that little algorithm here. Okay, so here's scramble, right? What do bash functions look like? Well, it's the name, right? Empty round brackets, and the braces denote the body of the function, right? So toArray is supposed to convert a string to an array, right? ToString is supposed to convert an array back to a string. Rand, random number between A and B, right? Shuffle, shuffle an array. Right? Okay, so the script starts as follows, right? So someone passes in one argument, so that's the string to be shuffled, right? Here's the array that's going to store, that I'm going to use to compute the shuffled string, right? So I'm going to call toArray. ToArray is going to take the string s and store the characters of s in the array ARR, right? Now remember how bash works with functions, right? When I call toArray, toArray knows that there's this variable s, and it knows that there's an array ARR in the, I guess, in memory somewhere, right? So in other words, you don't have to explicitly pass these to the array, right? Because I'm calling the function after I'm declaring the variables, those variables exist as far as the function is concerned, right? Shuffle is then going to shuffle ARR, right? ToString is going to take ARR and put the contents back into a string. What am I putting them back into? Putting them back into, oh, I'm going to print the string, right? I'm going to print the string. All right, so let's start at the top. ToArray. So this converts the string s to an array let me not, puts the characters of s into ARR. Okay, so how do I put the characters of s into ARR? Well, I loop over the characters of s, right? How do I loop over the characters of s? Well, I need the length of s, right? So the length of s is just equal to, now remember how to get the length of a string, right? So it's that, whoa, sorry, it's that wacky syntax there, right? So the length of a string, s, right? I need to put hashtag s. That all has to go inside of braces, and then you need the $ in front, right? So that's the length of s. Now I need a loop that runs over the elements of s. So I want to, basically I want to use an integer index here, right? So I want a counting style loop in this case, right? So I equals 0, I is less than the length, right? And then I++ at the end. Done. Okay, so inside the loop, I want to get the character at index I, right? So how do I get the character at index I? So this is where you need to remember, how do I get a substring from a string, right? So my character C is going to be equal to s. Now it's this weird syntax. So I need a colon. I need the index of the element that I want, right? So that's $I. And then I want the length of the string that I want. So the length is just one character, so that's 1, right? So that gets the character at index I from the string s, right? It's a character because there's only one character in the string, right? So that's cool, right? So I've got the character, yeah?
Why didn't you use $lamp?
Why didn't I use what, sorry?
$lamp.
Oh, sorry, that should be dollar length. Although in this case, you don't have to use dollar length. Okay, so inside the double round brackets, variable names don't need the dollar in front of it to dereference the variable. Inside double round, so whenever you're doing an arithmetic substitution or an arithmetic expression, you don't need the dollar sign. Yeah, so they both work. So this works, that works, either one. Right? I'll put it in though if you want, so it's fine. Okay, I've now got the character at index I. I now want to store it into the array at index I. Right? So fortunately, that's a little bit easier because array, when you store something in an array, you can just use the standard Python syntax. Right? So that's equal to $C in this case, right? There you go. So that's it. There's your function to array. Right? This function says it doesn't return anything. So it doesn't have to set the exit status to anything in particular. It doesn't have to print anything to standard output. Okay, now toString is going to go backwards. Right? It's going to take the array, join all of the elements of the array, and then print the string that's formed at the end. Right? So I need to form the string. Right? So my string that I'm going to print starts as the empty string. Right? Now I want to loop over the elements of the array. So I can just copy this array up, this loop up here. Boop, 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 like that. Right? I want to extract each character from the array. So fortunately, that's also easy. So to get each character of the array, I want to do $brace, ARR square I. There we go, like that. Right? Right. So when you want to get the value of an array element, $brace, then the name of the array, followed by the square brackets and the index that you want, and that has to have a dollar front in front of it. Yes.
Do you need to redeclare length, or does it know what?
Oh yeah, I'm going to need to redeclare length. Thank you. So the length of the array is blah, blah, that. Now this is even weirder, right? It's that, right, for the length of the array. So thank you. Yeah. So you do it this way. You could also use a for each loop here. So I'll show you the for each loop as well. Right? So there's my character C. I want to stick C onto the end of S, onto the end of string, sorry. So the way you do that is string equals $str, $C, like that. Right? So remember, everything in bash is just a string. So that's the value, or the current value of the string that I'm building, right? Followed by the character C. So that's how you do string concatenation in bash. I guess if you wanted to be a little bit safer about this, you would put the braces around the variable names. Right. Now you can also use a for each loop here. So the for each loop would look like, I want to do something like for, now what's this going to look like? For each element I, for each element C in $ARR and then square bracket at, like that. And you'd want to quote this. Although in this case you don't have to, because you know that it only contains single characters. Done. Right. Okay, so remember what this does for arrays. Right? So ARR square bracket at, that produces this string ARR1, 0, ARR1, ARR2, ARR3. Right? If you quote that, then that gives you double quote ARR0, space, double quote ARR1, space, double quote ARR2, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? So this gives you each element of the array quoted. Right? And then you can just write string equals $str, and then $C. Right? So I guess the for each loop is a little bit easier here. So either that way or this way, doesn't matter in this case, they both should work. Right? Now there's no block comments in bash, so I have to comment this line by line. Okay. And then it's supposed to print the string, but that's easy, you just echo $str. And I guess we should quote it just in case there's any spaces in our string. All right, so that's toString. rand. So rand, rand is a little bit different. Okay, so rand is supposed to generate a random number between a and b, right? Where a and b are arguments passed to the function, right? Now remember, how do you pass an argument to a function? Well, you just call the function like it's a command, right? And you pass in all the arguments just like you would pass arguments to a command, right? Inside the function, right, the parameters don't have any well, the parameters are just the, what are they called again? The numbered parameters. What are those called again? I forget what they're called. They're $1 and $2, right? So A is equal to $1 and B is equal to $2, right? So someone's going to call rand, they're going to pass in two arguments, right? The first argument is A, the second argument is B, right? I need to generate a random number between A and B, right? So the way you do that is you compute the difference between A and B, right? So B minus A, I want the positive difference, and B is supposed to be larger. Right? So I'm going to use an arithmetic substitution to compute the difference. Right? I guess I'm going to put the spaces in just to be consistent. Right? So remember, that's an arithmetic substitution, right? Double round bracket, right? B minus A, that's B minus A, right? I want to get the value of that and store it in n, so I need the $ in front, right? And that saves it in the variable n, right? So that's the difference between B and A. My value, my random value, is going to be equal to, and then another arithmetic substitution. So if I take the variable random, now remember, random is the variable that always stores a random value in bash, right? Every time you use random, you get a new random value, right? So if I take random, it's between 0 and some large number, and divide it by n and take the remainder, right? That gives me a random value back between 0 and n minus 1, right? Which is almost what I want, right? I want a random value between a and b minus 1, right? Where b is equal to a plus n, right? So to get a random value between a and b, you just add a to that, right? So compute the range of the values. Take your random number, divide it by the range, and get the remainder, and then add a to it, right? So that produces a random number between 0 and, in this case, this produces a random number between a and b in this case, right? And then the assignment says, the random number is printed to standard output so that the value can be used elsewhere. So echo v. Right? I don't have to quote v because I know this is a number. It's got no spaces or special characters in it. Right? And finally, shuffle. Oh wait, we're basically done. So shuffle, you just have to implement the link is in the page here. I'm going to post this after class. Right? So shuffle, you just have to implement this little algorithm here. Right? So what do I need here? I need the length of the array. Right? So you know how to get the length of the array. That's in the other function. Right? How do I get the random number? I just call the rand function I just wrote, right? Capture the output using a command substitution. How do I swap two array elements? You just swap two array elements, right? Create a third variable to store one value. Create a temporary variable to store one of the values, right? And then switch the two using the temporary variable, right? And then you're basically done. All right. Any questions before we go? We still have a couple of minutes, so I can take some questions. Yeah. Yeah, technically, yes, the way the script is written. Length would be in scope. But if you change the order of the way the functions were called, then no, it wouldn't be in scope. Yeah. 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 Okay, so someone's going to call rand. They're going to pass in two values, right? So to get those two values, I need to use $1 and $2. Rand is supposed to produce a random number between A and B, right? Okay. So if I take a value, sorry?
It's just the middle part.
It's just the middle? Oh, you mean n and v? Yeah. I need the range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we got that.
Yeah. So if I take a value and divide it by n, right? So if I take, say, 5 and divide it by 3, right? And compute the remainder, I get 2, right? Compute the remainder, right? So 5 divided by 3 is 1, remainder 2.
Random, do we always get an integer? Like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, right? So random's always some number, some random number, right? So if you compute that, right, you always get a random number between 0 minus 1. Right? Because if I pass in 5, yeah, that's right. So it's always between that and, right? So I need a value between A and B. I just add A to both sides. Yeah, I just add A to both sides.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi.
How long do we get to write the test?
50 minutes.
50.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. And I was also wondering, what's the mark distribution per type of question? So say, for example, you have a short question.
Oh, yeah.
In comparison to the medium.
12, then 4, that's 16, and then 4, and then 10.
4, 10, 16?
Yeah.
From,
So the long one at the end is 10 marks. The first one at the front is 12. So it's 12.
oh,
And then 4 for question 2. I think 4 for question 3. Yeah.
Wait, so the backup, do we have to back up the directory too?
Oh no, you don't have to back up the directory, just files.
And also for the password one? Wait, so it's supposed to be part of the symbol?
Sorry?
I'm not sure because you said quotes not part of the password, so do quotes have to be accepted?
No. Don't worry about quotes.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry about trying to test quotes.
So the symbols,
It becomes too awful.
so symbols should only
Yes.
include the ones listed here. Okay, got it. Thank you.
So I'm just looking at the end of for backup.
Yep. That's really long.
Yeah, I know. I gotta go through it. It's
All right.